Okay, let's make a start. Welcome to today's Transformation Journeys webinar. As you know, the struggles of inequality is mainstream, and we all have a role to play. But the topic of diversity and inclusion is on many people's minds. It's a huge issue, and when done correctly, is also a huge opportunity. And we'll discuss this over 2 consecutive webinars. Today, we're going to be covering the topic of shifting to an inclusive and culturally adaptive mindset, where we will lay the foundation for successful inclusion. Next week, we'll discuss how to scale up your impact by designing inclusion, so by building an ecosystem for sustainable transformation. You can register on the same Eventbrite page that you've actually registered for today. Okay, so my name is Glen Barber, and I'm lead partner at Awaken Group. Awaken Group's a transformation design firm that has been co-creating with clients across APAC for over 10 years. Our work includes supporting clients through strategy, leadership and design, and we ensure that every engagement is human-centered, and whether that's working on strategy or on culture. So, the topics that we cover in transformation design makes today's topic even more relevant. So just before I introduce our expert panelists, I just want to call out a couple of key housekeeping points before we start. So at the bottom of your screen, you should have a couple of different icons. There's a Q&A, there's a chat, and there will be also access to a poll. And we'll be doing a couple of polls at the start. So if you can just use the Q&A, and I see there's already a couple of chats coming through, so that's wonderful. And just while I do introduce our 2 experts today, so Audrey and Nadine, if you could actually just go to the chat and just put in there, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? So if you can just go to the chat there, just a couple of lines. Love to just see what diversity and inclusion means to you. Okay, so the 2 experts that we have with us today, the 2 guests, are both senior consultants with Awaken Group. You've got Audrey Lee and also Nadine Chetty. So Audrey leads Awaken Group's leadership and coaching practice, where she supports leaders across APAC in regards to building out their global leadership skills. And she's also the co-author of a book called Flex, the new playbook for managing across differences. Welcome, Audrey.
Hi, Glenn.
And I'd also like to introduce you to Nadine Chetty. So I met Nadine a few years ago, and Nadine's been working with Awaken Group on a number of different projects, including Changi Airport International, Sephora, and also some of the startups. Nadine has an immense experience in regards to being an HR professional across a number of different continents. She's a leadership coach, and over the last couple of years has been supporting startups with the development of their people strategy, as well as the execution of that strategy. So welcome, Nadine.
Hey, Glenn, thanks for the warm welcome.
No problems. Okay, so both Nadine and Audrey are based in Singapore as well, out of that Singapore office. So that's great. Please keep those notes coming through. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Tom. We'll actually connect to some of the points you put in the chat there throughout the session. So it's really great. So please, if everyone could just throw in your comments there, that helps ensure that we make this topic even more inclusive as well. So just to get us started, Audrey, Nadine, love to hear from you as a baseline. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you?
Yeah.
Nadine, can you start us?
Yeah, so I think diversity for me is about bracing and building upon each person's uniqueness. And inclusion is about the acceptance and welcoming and belonging that a person feels within an organization, rather than the othering of people. So we'll touch on the concept of othering later on, but that's basically what I think it is.
Yeah, I love that, Nadine. And I can see also a lot of people are talking about that sense of belonging and not reducing people to a single denominator. It also looks like respect is coming up quite a bit too. So I know we'll be talking about all of those things later on. And for me, as I've been talking about diversity and inclusion, diversity is how we get the people with differences into the same room and at the table. And inclusion for me is who gets to speak at that table and who gets heard in the room. So, if we're thinking in terms of sports analogies, it's who gets to be in the game and then who gets to play.
Yeah. And why, in the business sense, why is that so important?
Yeah, so if we look at it, if we're looking at performance, there's a couple of stats here that we've got. So firstly, McKinsey looks at, if you've got a good gender mix, you've got 21% more likelihood to outperform your competitors, as well as a good ethnic mix, you're going to outperform by 33%. The Catalyst report is a report that's really well known for leadership and also diversity. And they say if you've got women on boards and executive teams, you're 73% more likely to have your bottom line sales go higher, as well as have a 83% ROI, higher ROI. So, to become more innovative, to become more productive, being inclusive, it really hits your bottom line there. And then the Center for Talent Innovation looks at two dimensions in terms of diversity and inclusion. It looks at representation, but it also looks at how your programs and competence around inclusion. And they show that, if you've got those aspects, then you're going to be more likely to have a better market share and capture new markets. And then if you look at talent, which is just the next slide, Hayes Asia did this report just in 2019, and they showed that Singaporeans really feel that if you've got diversity and inclusion is a key contributor to impacting a company's culture. And they also felt that it had an impact on retention. Whereas Gallup showed in the US that, that if you unengaged employees, there's a more likelihood of turnover and them leaving. So it does impact your retention and your talent and the attraction of talent into the bottom line.
Yeah, those are great touch points, Nadine, just to look at the business case, right, and how it benefits the businesses to have diversity and inclusion be part of a company's initiative. And I thought it would be a great opportunity now to see what the opportunity is for Singapore with the businesses here in Singapore. And I know there's actually such a great vision here for Singapore to be a global leader, to be known for industry practices and innovation best practices. So with that vision and that opportunity and that goal in front of us, I was looking at the 2019 Global Kantar Inclusion Index. And actually Singapore scored the second from the bottom. And there are 14 studies based on diversity, representation, programs, treatment, feedback from people who are minority populations. And with that score, we also looked at back to the Hayes report from 2019 to see that about 58 to 67% of Singaporean firms actually have diversity and inclusion programs or key initiatives. So thinking about diversity as a firm, there's still a lot of opportunity to move forward with that initiative and bring that forward and have more programs, have that as a focus. And as we were, thinking about the diverse local teams that are here in Singapore, there's an increase in diversity here in Singapore and the overseas candidates that have been employed. So when we think about the teams here becoming more diverse, that's one measurement to think about. And also companies here in Singapore are also working closely with global teams and partners, customers, stakeholders across the borders. So there's a real need actually to think about this issue in the midst of our global environment. So I think the opportunity is really huge for growth. I see these numbers as a call to action and a way to differentiate companies that are already starting to think about diversity and inclusion as a competitive advantage on a global level. So a way to take Singaporean companies and Singapore as a country into a place where they can showcase global leadership. And finally, I think these business case stats are so important. But as Nadine and I were thinking about diversity and inclusion as an issue, we were taking a step back from our daily workplace and businesses to take in an even bigger picture. We actually have some global problems going on right now that are really coming to the forefront in ways that, haven't really been seen before. And I think that as we're looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, we're looking at social unrest, we're looking at racial inequality, we're looking at climate change, we're looking at things that impact our environment and our universe. These are global problems that require us to come together and really find global solutions. So we have to talk to each other. We have to learn how to live together and to work together on this planet. So, with that, I think that sort of sets the tone for the real need to have this discussion.
Yeah, and it's discussion. It is a discussion. And the beauty about that is to have that discussion, you need to have that open mindset too. That opportunity, that growth mindset to actually be in that space. And I know you're both very passionate about that. So it's a complex topic. So just love to know more, Nadine, in regards to why you actually really want to focus on that mindset, that shift.
So I think when you look at organizations, most of the time when they look at D&I, they focus on quotas, so, gender, race, orientation, disability. And it's not, if you don't take mindset into consideration, that transformation is not sustainable. And it brings me back to, I was born in South Africa during apartheid, and apartheid fell in 1994. And so, we're 26 years odd after apartheid. And at the start of it, the government really focused on programs that looked at economic development of Black people. So they looked at programs and incentives that would increase the economic status of the Black community, which is really, really great. However, they didn't go into the community, and because the communities were still segregated, so white people still lived in white areas, Black people still lived in Black areas, and Indians and coloreds in the same. We would be politically correct in the workplace, but we'd go back to our communities and the mindset would be reinforced. Whatever the prejudice we had, so whatever the prejudice was in the white community or the Indian community, it just kept getting reinforced. And so if you look currently today in South Africa, it is still a white-Black rooted issue. And so if we can't go deeper into ourselves, if we can't get perspective of what our mindset is, how do we other people, what are our prejudices and discriminations, then we can't look at how we change the systems. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the main issue for why we felt mindset is really important to start at first.
Yeah, no, I love that. I've worked in organisations before where we went straight to metrics, and there was certainly a shift and some strong shift, though not everybody was actually ready for that type of journey.
Yeah.
So there's
if you look at the typical,
as well.
If you look at the typical iceberg, if you only focus on the top, the surface issues, if you don't go into the behaviors, you can't get real change.
Yeah, that's right. Deep transformation.
Yeah. So at this point, we're just going to run a quick poll, 2 questions. Just a quick one, just to get an understanding as to where people that are dialed in are actually at. So the first question, how inclusive and culturally adaptable are you? So 5-point scale, 1 is low, 5 is high. How inclusive and culturally adaptable are you? And then the second question down the bottom there is, how inclusive and culturally adaptable is your organisation? 1 low, 5 is high. So we can just take a quick moment to complete that. And Audrey, as the results start to come in, I know you're going to share a model with us, which I absolutely love. When you've taken me through it, I absolutely love it. So can you also just draw a connection from the model as well with what you're actually seeing in the results when they come through in just a moment?
Absolutely. Should I wait for the poll to come through? Oh, here.
Yeah, they're coming through. Okay,
so we have, looks like we have most people at 4. 65% of you feel that you are inclusive and culturally adaptable. Great, fantastic. And then as far as the organization, 35% at 2, and 30% at 3. So in the middle to the lower middle there when you're talking about your organization. Great, that's really great to know. And I think as we were thinking about this conversation, it's really important for us to get a sense for where we are. And, as we think about that, most of us, I think, are sitting here thinking, yeah, I'm pretty inclusive. And I think I have those skills where I'm including people, and I have this mindset where nobody's better than each other. And I really, really want to have everybody belong and not feel like they're being left out. And that's really a great place to start. But as we're having this conversation, I think it's also important to have a way to measure ourselves and the teams and organizations. And I was really excited to find this model created by an American sociologist, Milton Bennett, that actually put some measurement around what inclusivity and a culturally adaptive mindset looks like. And he put together a framework with 5 phases that shows how you go from a monocultural and very homogenous mindset moving into and developing into a multicultural and adaptive mindset. And there's actually also an externally validated assessment that goes along with that. And so I've been able to use this model and the assessment for the last 10, 15 years as I've worked with global companies and individuals. And that's been so helpful to be able to have this framework that's been highly researched, used over the last 30 years to define the journey. Because, this, I know that at Awaken Group, we talk a lot about transformation journeys and how difficult, how messy transformation journeys are. And this is definitely a journey that's messy. And as I've worked with people through this assessment, really it's important to know that no matter where you've been assessed or where you think you are, there's no judgment on that, because we are wherever we are, and that's where we start. So that's just really important as we move along. And that's why I think this framework is important, because it's not looking at pointing fingers. It's really just saying, hey, where can we move forward and develop? So as we look at this, as we look at the different phases, we start actually in this first phase of denial. And, people who are in denial, when they see difference, they actually miss it completely. So they don't even necessarily know it's there. They experience their culture as really the real one and the one that's relevant. So other cultures may not actually be noticed at all, or if they are noticed, it's very simplistic, a simplistic description of it. So if you hear people who are in denial talk, they might have an attitude that reflects the attitude of, why do we need special programs for them? Why do we need special programs for Gen Zers or millennials, right? And if you're somebody in a minority community, in a diverse population, and you're part of an organization or a team or a group that's in denial, you'll feel ignored. You'll feel completely invisible, like you're not there at all. And so moving on from denial, the next phase is defense. And if you're in defense, you actually do see difference, but you look at that difference and you judge it. And it's likely, if you're in this phase, that you think your own culture is the most evolved, it's the most enlightened, and it's the best way to live. And there's a real, us versus them mentality and mindset. This is where you'll hear a lot of negative stereotyping, a lot of not just unconscious bias, but a lot of overt and conscious bias. And a lot of people in defense who are in the dominant majority might even feel threatened and attacked by those who are in the minority groups. So a very common mindset you might hear in the defense phase is, there are just too many of them here. And, they'll never be leaders until they become more aggressive, or they dress like us, or they talk like us. So if you're in a minority population, again, and your organization is in defense, you might feel like you don't belong. It's really uncomfortable. And probably worst of all, you'll feel like you're not talking the right way, that you're wearing the wrong clothes, that you're not communicating in the right way, and you'll just feel overall wrong as a person. And so moving past defense, this third phase is called minimization. So if you're in minimization, you look at difference and your tendency is to actually de-emphasize that difference and just focus on commonality. So just focus on these universal traits, and it's a great way to get past a conversation of difference. So you probably say, you know, people are people. You know, if you prick us, we all bleed, we're all human, and I don't see color. And in this phase, you know, because there's a tendency to overemphasize this commonality and the fact that we're all the same, a lot of times people who are in diverse groups, they feel like they can't express parts of them that are different. They can't fully live this out in a dominant majority. So a lot of times, you know, when I've seen engagement surveys from employees who are diverse, a lot of times what they put down on that employee survey is, I really can't bring myself to work. You know, I can't be my authentic self. I just go along to get along. And I've been so good at doing that, you know, sometimes I don't even think about it. So as much as, you know, minimization still focuses on, you know, de-emphasizing difference, I have to say that it's actually a really important bridge to moving over to a multicultural mindset. Because once we're in minimization, we're not thinking of them or they are not a threat anymore. So that mindset is gone in minimization, and we can actually move on and get to the next phase, which is acceptance. And this phase, you know, it's really the phase where we start to feel empathy, and we start to deeply understand difference when we see it. So what we'll hear a lot of times in this phase is, you know, I see your experience, I hear your point of view, it's valid, and I'm beginning to know what it's like to walk in your shoes. I also noticed that in acceptance, there's a shift in your own experience, how you see your own experience. So it's not, you see your own experience is not just the way to do it, but my way is just one of many. And that shift is really important as far as how you start to process your own experiences. And people who are in diverse populations in an organization that's at the acceptance phase actually feels heard and understood. And so, you know, finally we reach this last phase, which is adaptive mindsets and behaviors, where we actually are able to bridge across and use and recognize and leverage differences. So we're not ignoring them. We're not saying that they're not there so we can just get along. And we're not tolerating, and we're not just appreciating, but we've said, hey, we fully see the beauty and value in these traits and differences that are not actually our own. We know how to walk the talk. We know how to work harmoniously with other people. And actually people in both groups, the majority and the minority groups, feel valued and they feel involved. So I think this is actually a really great goal for companies, because this is where our diversity really becomes an asset and really becomes something that makes that business case for diversity and inclusion. And as we like to say, you know, transformation, this takes a lot of work. There's a study done by Forbes in 2017 that talks about teams that are ethnically and diverse gender-wise and age-wise, that these teams actually make better decisions up to 87% of the time. So they're working really well together. They're very productive, high performance. However, before they actually were able to become high performance teams, you know, I'm looking at some research done by JJ DeStefano, who's a professor at IMD, who studies a lot of cultural competence and programs as well as team performance. And he was able to unearth how diverse and single culture teams performed. And the findings were really interesting. So when he looked at diverse and multicultural teams that were really well managed by leaders who had a high level of cultural competency and who really knew how to integrate all of those differences and take in consideration all of that diversity, the performance actually went up. But when those same diverse teams were managed poorly by people who did not know how to integrate those differences and manage those, they actually performed worse than single culture teams. So we're looking at that middle section where what does it take to actually produce that high-performing team? And what we're finding is that they actually need the skill set to be trained, because it's not natural. We have to think about it. And to really look at what cultural competency and adaptability skill sets need to happen in order to leverage that diversity. And as we're looking at these cogs in the wheel, you know, what links diversity, which is who's in the room, together with inclusion, which is who gets heard and who's at the table, are these mindsets of adaptation, being able to move forward without bias, what I call fluent leader traits, which move into actually translating into skill sets around global leadership and how do we treat each other, how do we actually move that into the context of business and life. And these are actually, we can't go into these programs today, but these are going to be included in part 2 as we discuss designing inclusion for your organization. So that's just a little bit of a preview.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love the model, and I love the term cultural competency as well in regards to, you know, what it is and the breakdown of it. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those key areas you've just pointed out. And Nadine, if you could just start us, if you can just share a little bit more around when denial and defense phases come to life, when you see that, and not just within organizations, but within our lives as well. Can you just share some perspective around that, please?
So I think if you look at it, it shows up mainly as, you know, when you see in-group and out-group. And if you look at in-groups, this shows up as affinity bias. So it's, you know, that human beings are implicitly wired to trust and have a preference for people like us. Mm-hmm. And so we gravitate towards that. I'm going to bring back the example back to my youth and my own experience. When I was 9, I moved from South Africa to Ireland. And I was really confounded as a 9-year-old because I moved from South Africa where it was a black, white, colored issue. That's how we segregated people. Religion never came into it. So we would celebrate Diwali and Eid, everyone celebrated together. And then I moved to Ireland, and Ireland was at that time in the late 70s, 99% white, probably 99.9% white. And there the division was Protestants against Catholics. And I looked at it and was like, you know, what's going on? Like, here we've got race, here we've got religion. And it's this whole thing about, you know, we feel safer when we're around people that are like us and that we can trust. So that's how it shows up. We get defensive of the other, but we keep to our own groups.
Thank you. I was going to ask for the slide to be moved. And Audrey, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's a lot of power being defined by the other when we think about what it is to be like in an in-group dynamic and to be, you know, the cool people in the room, the right people doing the right things, and then what it's like to be outside of that circle, how easy it is to go into that place, to want to stay into that place. You know, we know it's a good place to be when we get to hold that power. And as we were thinking about that, you know, a quote came to mind, and I'd like to share it because I've used it quite a bit to talk about the experience of the other. And it was actually written by an American author, Douglas Adams. And the quote is, "It is difficult to be sat on all day, every day, by some other creature without forming an opinion on them. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible to sit all day, every day, on top of another creature and not have the slightest thought about them whatsoever." You know, and this quote has always just struck me a lot because, well, now we actually do have a very clear picture of what it looks like to sit on another human being. But for the most part, you know, for us in our daily lives, we probably don't think about that literally. But figuratively, I think this is very powerful. I think it's powerful to think about how and when we've experienced this. You know, we've all been sat on in some way. We've all been the other. We've been in the out group. And we know what that feels like to not hold power and to have someone else on top of us where we're like, please get off. And you're hurting me. And So if we think about that experience for ourselves, and then we think about, oh, you know, we've probably all sat on someone too. We've probably had that experience where we've held that power of being in the in-group and we have been sitting on someone else. What does that feel like now that we're thinking about that? How does that convict us and call us into a different place and a different mindset? And I've been thinking about this quite a bit because, you know, Glenn, I'm from New York City, right? You know, and being from the U.S., I'm actually in the minority, and actually I'm in a double minority because I'm a Chinese American woman. But when I moved to Singapore last fall, it was a real aha moment because I'm ethnic Chinese. I'm actually in the dominant majority in-group now, you know, and also as an American, you know, I'm not Singaporean, but in many circles, I'm actually seen as privileged. So that I have to really pay attention and be aware of that dynamic and listen to other voices and consider where I might be seen as the cool person in the room, or maybe not so cool, but certainly in the in crowd, who is not being heard, who is not being brought to the table, and who am I validating and who am I not validating even subconsciously.
Yeah, and I think, Audrey, what I'd add to that is when we consciously or unconsciously other people, we kind of forget our commonality as a human race. Like we forget that, you know, we're similar and that we're not a threat. We don't have to be a threat to each other. But it's a learned behavior, I think. And it kind of brings back that, I don't know if you remember that experiment that Jane Elliott did. I think she did it just after Martin Luther King died. And she took her primary school kids and she divided them into blue eyes and brown eyed kids. And she told the class that the children with brown eyes were smarter. And so she gave them more privilege. And, you know, the blue-eyed kids had to come in later to class, or they did to just do certain things that the brown-eyed kids didn't have the privilege. And what she found soon enough was that the brown-eyed kids started to be superior, started to bullying the blue-eyed kids. And it became this kind of learned behavior within 2 or 3 days. And so when we do this, we start to make assumptions and we start to kind of reinforce our worldview of it. Whereas we don't really look at how, and it's really challenging, I think, now, especially when we're benefiting from the privilege of the systems that we have in place. It's harder to see, okay, my mindset is supporting this system and I'm benefiting for it. And then it becomes like a conscious choice. Do I want to make that change?
So true.
There's from the poll before, thanks Nadine, from the poll before, there seems like there's quite a few people sort of sitting in that middle phase as well, and you spoke about minimization. So I'll just dive a little bit deeper there. If I could just share a bit more about minimization, if Q&A, you've got specific questions that you'd like answered, please.
Sorry, Glenn, I think your mic.
I was muted. So yes, I was just saying, we can talk when we dive right into your organisation. Have questions?
So I think he was trying to say, Audrey, can you talk more about minimization? That's what I got from him.
Yes, and I think he was talking about the poll, which is so true. I think the poll showed that most of us feel like we're quite far along, at a 4 and moving along, and that's really great and very common. Actually, this area of minimization, I think Glenn was talking about, through this assessment and the people that I've worked with, about 62% of people who take the assessment are actually in the minimization phase. So it's more than half of us are actually in this phase. And when I've worked with companies before, the C-suite executives are in minimization, sometimes actually partly even in defense. And top HR people, and even, diversity and inclusion professionals are in this space. So, this is where a lot of us are starting. And like I mentioned, it's a bridge phase. It's where we finally have this commonality, and it's really important that we do that. because it's through this commonality that we find empathy, that we have start to begin to be curious. And, it's actually the first phase in this journey where we start thinking in terms of we rather than us and them. So I think it's actually, there's nothing to be ashamed of this phase, in thinking, this is, people are people, we have common experiences, we have common needs and values. But there's actually a danger of staying there or thinking that this is the highest way to think, because, as I mentioned, it's not seeing the unique differences of people. And if you don't see those differences, we actually can't fully integrate them into the conversation. And also, I wanted to share that there's this, I was working with an executive, and he was saying to me, well, Audrey, this is great. This model's great, and talking about cultural competency is great, but I think, to me, it's really just about respect. We just really have to respect people, and because people are people. And I said, that's totally true, but we have to understand that even though we have a universal need for respect, and that's the universal value, we express respect and we experience respect very differently based on our own experiences. So in the US, respect is, if I look at you straight in the eye and give you eye contact, I'm respecting you. I'm being honest, I'm being transparent, and that's actually what they look for. But in a lot of cultures, if you look at somebody in the eye, you are not respecting them. So it's the opposite experience. And so we have to take into consideration that we're not just talking about these common values, but we're talking and we're listening to experiences. So that's sort of the danger of that. The other thing I also like to share is, in this minimization phase, a lot of people, when they come to me, they're like, oh, I didn't even notice that you were an Asian American woman. You're just like everyone else. Didn't even see that. I'm colorblind, And I said, I actually don't want that. I want people to see me and actually to experience me for who I am. So that's kind of this middle phase. We need it. We have to have this before we can move on to actually process difference. But we don't want to stay there.
Yeah. And it's a great, even the model again, just having that visual as to where am I? So you know how to actually, where I need to go and how to move forward. But for the people who have dialed in, Audrey and Nadine, can you share, how do they actually move from that minimization to that adaptive? Because that's a big step for a lot of organizations. Yeah. Where do they start?
I think the first thing is to have compassion for yourself and for others, because, this is a difficult subject, and it can be difficult for us to reconcile our own mindsets and have acceptance of it. And the second, I think, is then just curiosity and vulnerability to just understand where we are. And I mentioned before, a lot of the time we're benefiting from these systems and we don't really see how we're propping up the system and benefiting from it. And so we really have to be curious, do I want to change my mindset? And if I want to change my mindset, what am I going to do about it? And how can I have compassion for myself, just to sit with that and recognize, what stage am I at? And then how do I want to change that, and where do I want to move to?
Yeah, I think with that compassion for self and other, and as you're moving into that vulnerability, there's this place, as I was talking with a lot of leaders doing research for my book, we found that the people who were really digging into the self and other awareness and coming to that compassion and coming to the empathy that they needed were also coming into a level of humility where they can see the big picture and own their own behavior in a very humble way, but then be able to take that and use that to move forward after sitting in some discomfort to grow in this area. And, to know that it's messy and that you're in the state of discovery, but to travel along with it and really listening and taking to heart the experiences of the other. So I think all of those things are really, really critical, in addition to taking a look at some cultural adaptability skills and ways that you can start processing your own biases and microaggressions and those type of skills. Really, really critical for moving forward to the adaptive mindset.
So we may just have a couple of minutes just to be able to answer a couple of questions in a moment. So if you do have any questions, just put them in the Q&A at the bottom there. But just final question from me. And Nadine, if you could take this one first. How do we actually use this mindset where we truly see each other as a we, from that collaboration perspective that we're all working together? How do we tackle that one, Nadine?
Sorry, I've unmuted. So I think one of the issues is that one of the things that we really need to do is appreciate the importance of stories. We've got these stories that go on. So we've got these narratives that go on internally, and then we have these stories that are external. And we can really kind of start sharing our stories and sharing, collectively learning from them. Then we can gain deeper perspective, and we can ensure that, we uncover our biases. So by talking about it, sharing our stories, sharing our experiences, we get deeper experience and perspective, and then we can then collectively learn. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. I echo that too, Nadine. Like when you have stereotypes, and when you hear about stereotypes, a lot of times the stereotypes are because a single story is out there. So we need to actually see each other as not just two-dimensional with one truth or one story out there, but really we are all fully three-dimensional human beings with complex and rich and beautiful backgrounds. So seeing those, hearing those stories, it's actually the start of creating a dialogue where there's sharing and there's listening. And we're actually hearing our needs, and we're hearing all of that can start moving us forward toward using this mindset. And I actually think this sounds actually very personal, and it is. And that's actually what we wanted to talk about. But this is something that translates directly into this work in organizations, because you have to have this to move forward beyond just, we're just doing a training session, or we have some compliance checklists that we're putting together, and that comprises our D&I initiative. So if we really want to have this dialogue, that's what moves us forward.
Yeah, and we know stories are such a key part of any transformation. So having that ability to actually and the courage to share those stories is very powerful. So can I just have the next slide, please? Yep. So just connected to the stories, Nadine and Audrey have kindly offered to actually lead a session. So those who are interested in actually being able to explore how to use your personal stories as that first step to create a dialogue on diversity and inclusion within your organisation, then Audrey and Nadine have actually created an opportunity there to have them provide a coaching session with you on that. So you can obviously use the QR barcode there, or on the link, sign up. So there's a few spots available. So if you could, if you're interested in that, then please take up that opportunity. I think it's very rare when you have the somebody who's been a global leader when it comes to inclusiveness and diversity, like Audrey, and somebody who's so passionate in regards to supporting others and driving change like Nadine. So great opportunity there. So at this point, I'd love to thank Audrey, Nadine, very much for sharing your insight today. So thank you very much for your time. There will be another session that we're running next week. So if I can just have that slide, please. Apart from having mute, also having a couple of technical slide issues there, but here we go. So next week, there'll be part 2 of this series. So tell your work colleagues as well. So around designing inclusion and building that ecosystem for sustainable transformation. So Audrey and Nadine will also be joined by Steve Mann. And Steve's a gentleman that I know firsthand actually led a great deal of diversity and inclusive change within a very large organisation. And he's incredibly passionate in driving male champions of change initiatives. So looking forward to having Steve as well. So once again, right on time. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Nadine. And for anybody that, if you have questions, as you know, as you start to spark in regards to that model that Audrey presented before, then please just reach out to us and we'll have a deeper conversation about it. So, so once again, thank you, everybody. Stay safe and look forward to seeing you again next week. All the best.